All right, today we are continuing the series that Pastor John has kind of started us on here in Kings and Chronicles. And thus far, I would guess that the stories of these kings, maybe at least their names, have been familiar to us. If you had asked me a week or two ago to list the kings in order, I probably could have gotten you to Rehoboam and Jeroboam pretty confidently. But if you had asked me any names past them, I'd be like, I have no idea. So when Pastor John assigned me the text today and I read about this guy named Abijah, there were no bells going off in my mind from like junior church years. There was nothing from previous, Bible studies that was clicking in my mind. I was like, honestly, I've never heard of this guy before. Maybe not even his name up until a week or two ago. Kind of curious. Have you guys heard of Abijah? Do you know his story?
Yeah, but don't, I can't remember anything about them.
Yeah, I knew like literally nothing about him. So it's kind of exciting today. I think we'll get to explore some new territory in the scriptures. We kind of feel like pioneers in a way, opening up, turning to a page in the Bible that we just don't set our eyes on that often. That's kind of exciting. And as we experience it together, I'm going to be asking some questions so that we'll just kind of we see it in real time and we'll kind of respond to some of the stuff that we're reading about. So please be willing to chime in this morning and just give your observations. We'll start in Second Chronicles 13. There is kind of a parallel passage in Kings that we'll look at later. We're introduced to Abijah in Second Chronicles 13. Just a little bit of background for you. He was the son of Rehoboam. So he ruled in the southern kingdom of Judah for just 3 years, kind of a short reign. He is a contemporary with Jeroboam in the northern kingdom. So he and Jeroboam's reign overlapped for a little bit of time. I think, at least that 3 years that he was king. I would assume it's that length of time. One of the things that we were told about Rehoboam and Jeroboam is that they had war between each other continually. And it seems like Abijah kind of follows in his dad's footsteps and continues the war that his father had started. Because when we read about Abijah, he's fighting against Jeroboam. And that's kind of where the text opens up. Notice verse 1 of chapter 13. We read in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijah began to reign over Judah. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. Now there was war between Abijah and Jeroboam. Abijah went out to battle, having an army of valiant men of war, 400,000 chosen men. And Jeroboam drew up his line of battle against him with 800,000 chosen mighty warriors. I'll just pause there for a second and comment that this is a pretty significant army that these guys are able to muster against each other. If you remember, Pastor John pointed out that when Jeroboam took the northern kingdom, all of the godly people left the northern kingdom and fled to Judah. And still, Jeroboam is able to muster an army of 800,000 men.
Wow.
It's kind of sad as well to think that not too long ago in our reading plan, we were reading about a united Israel that was entering into the promised land and supposed to be driving out the Canaanites. And here we are in Chronicles reading about a divided Israel that has now directed their aggression towards each other. You just kind of wonder, like, is this really what God intended for his people? For there to be civil war? That this is the consequence of sin, right? This is what we're seeing on display here for us is this civil war that breaks out between these guys. The kingdom is just kind of falling apart here. We'll keep reading in verse 4. Then Abijah, the king of Judah, stood up on Mount Zemaraim, that is in the hill country of Ephraim, and said, "Hear me, O Jeroboam, and all Israel." I want you to pay careful attention to what he's about to say here. Ought you not to know that the Lord God of Israel gave the kingship over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt. Yet Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, a servant of Solomon, the son of David, rose up and rebelled against his lord. And certain worthless scoundrels gathered about him and defied Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, when Rehoboam was young and irresolute and could not withstand them. Now, I got a question for you. After reading that section, what do you make of Abijah's summary of how Jeroboam came to power? He just spent a couple of verses kind of rehashing how Jeroboam became king. What are your thoughts after looking at that?
Rebellious brat.
Okay. Yeah, that's certainly how he portrays it. Any other thoughts? All right, maybe it was just me, but did you read this and think that his summary was a little biased, a little one-sided? When he describes Jeroboam here, he makes him out to be like this ultimate bad guy, like Cubby just said a minute ago, like a brat, right? He says Jeroboam rebelled against Solomon, and then he gathered all these worthless men and took advantage of Rehoboam when he was young. It seems as if Abijah is kind of giving a one-sided perspective on how Jeroboam came to power. But let me ask you, if you know the fuller picture, if you know the whole story, how might you fill in some of the gaps about how Jeroboam came to power? What's missing from this retelling? What's missing from this account?
The way Rehoboam, um, when he became king, he took advice from the young guys and not
Yes.
from, and
Yes.
he really suppressed the people.
Right. Could you go even further back than even Rehoboam and think about how this kingdom was divided? Do you remember the cause, the initial cause for the division of the kingdom? Had to do with Solomon and the way that his kingdom ended.
He also suppressed the people and he didn't walk with the Lord at all.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, Abijah seems to leave out the God component out of his retelling of this story, right? He makes Jeroboam out to be this bad guy, but in actuality, what had happened was that Solomon's many wives had turned his heart away from the Lord. As a result, God said, I will let you continue your reign over a united Israel, but with your son, I'm going to tear the kingdom out of his hand. So that when Rehoboam came to power, the means that God used to split the kingdom was what Marilyn just said, that Rehoboam listened to the counsel of his peers, the younger men, that said to make the burden heavier, and that is what contributed to the dividing of the kingdom. Now, it's possible that what Abijah is saying here, the perspective that he's giving, is true to an extent. Maybe there are some elements of Jeroboam kind of being a rebel, a brat. I will admit that. But he definitely leaves out what we would consider to be the God component from all of this. When he's addressing the people of Israel, never once do we see any of the behind the scenes account. Does that make sense? Are you seeing that in his summary? So let me ask you this. Where does that leave us? This is rhetorical. But as we study the Bible and as we consider Abijah's summary of Jeroboam, how are we supposed to evaluate what he's saying? Is he just being biased? Is he blatantly lying? Is it possible that he is just totally ignorant of what God had done in the generations before him? Possible. It's possible that those things are true, but I think that there is another explanation that actually is going to help us understand the whole story. Commentators have helped me to realize that it's possible that Abijah is simply trying to avoid conflict by describing Jeroboam's rise to power this way. I'll see if I can bring that out for you guys. I think that what he's trying to do is actually make peace. Think about the setting in which Abijah gives this speech here. He's standing on a hillside, on a mountaintop, overlooking an army of 800,000 men, right? He only has 400,000 guys. Do you think that the wise military strategy would be to stand on this mountain and shake his fist at Jeroboam and get him all riled up? No, right? The wise strategy is actually going to be to make peace, to try and dispel the conflict. And I'm not just guessing about Abijah's strategy here. The Bible actually tells us what Abijah is trying to do. Let's jump down to the end of verse 12. Right at the end of verse 12, Abijah says, "O sons of Israel, do not fight against the Lord, the God of your fathers, for you cannot succeed." Do you see how at the end of this whole thing, Abijah is actually advising Israel to stand down? He is aligning himself and his army with God, and he's saying, if you fight against us, if you fight against the Lord, this is not going to go well for you guys. So stand down. Don't fight us here. Abijah does not want conflict. So with that in mind, let's go back and try and understand then what he's saying about Jeroboam. How can we understand this uh, his speech about how Jeroboam came to power? Well, there's a key phrase in verse 5. Maybe you noticed it as we read through it the first time around, where Abijah refers to this covenant of salt. Do you see it there in the text? Kind of a strange word. Maybe the broader context is Abijah says that God gave the kingship over Israel forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt. Now, I had no idea what this meant up until like yesterday. Maybe you have like a cross reference in your Bible that takes you over to Numbers 18, I believe. In both instances, here and in Numbers, the word forever is used. In Numbers 18, we're told about a covenant of salt forever. Here in Second Chronicles 13, we read about how God had made a uh, a covenant of salt with David and his sons forever. You can see it there in the text. So this has led people to conclude that a covenant of salt is really just a covenant that is, maybe we would say, eternal, long lasting, that it's permanent. I think one person I read commented on how salt has a preservative function. So when Abijah refers to this covenant of salt, he's talking about how God made a covenant with David that would last forever. Can you think, even as I mentioned that, about this covenant? Does that ring a bell in your mind that God had made with David that was permanent? Do you remember one of the specifics of this covenant?
He would always have a descendant.
Yes, you nailed it. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, prior to this, God makes a covenant with David and says that a descendant of yours is going to sit on the throne forever. Right? So let's think about why Abijah would be mentioning this covenant right now. Well, Abijah is a son of David. He's David's great grandson. So here he is standing against Jeroboam and saying to Jeroboam and his army, remember, God made a covenant with David and his sons that one of their descendants would rule forever. In essence, if you attack me, you're attacking God and the promise that he has made to David. I think verse 8 kind of captures the logic that Abijah is using here. He says, now you think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord in the hand of the sons of David, right? It appears as if Abijah is saying, hey, just so you guys know, before you start this battle, I'm a son of David. God has made a promise to me that a descendant of David would sit on a throne forever. So when we think about his explanation of how Jeroboam came to power, certainly we know that God was at work in Jeroboam's rise to power. We already addressed that. But did Jeroboam have an eternal covenant made with him? No, he didn't. God said, if you are faithful to me, Jeroboam, I will establish your house like I did David's. But he made no such covenant with him like he did with David and his descendants. So given conflict between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Abijah is saying, God is going to keep his promises. I am going to be victorious in a skirmish. Jeroboam, you are not going to be able to overthrow me or the kingdom of Judah because God has made a promise, not to you, but to me, but to us. Do you see that in the text? Though outnumbered 2-1, Abijah is confident in the promises of God. Jeroboam is not going to be able to overthrow him because of the promise that had been made to David. I said this already. There's a second reason that Abijah advises Israel to stand down. That appears for us in this like middle third of the chapter here. We'll start back up in verse 8 and read through down to verse 12. Abijah says, now you think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord in the hand of the sons of David, because you are a great multitude, and have with you the golden calves that Jeroboam made you for gods. Have you not driven out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Aaron and the Levites, and made priests for yourselves like the peoples of other lands? Whoever comes for ordination with a young bull or 7 rams become a priest of what are not gods. But as for us, the Lord is our God, and we have not forsaken him. We have priests ministering to the Lord who are sons of Aaron and Levites for their service. They offer to the Lord every morning and every evening burnt offerings and incense of sweet spices, set out the showbread on the table of pure gold, and care for the lampstand, that its lamps may burn every evening. For we keep the charge of the Lord our God, but you have forsaken him. Behold, God is with us at our head, and his priests with their battle trumpets to sound the call to battle against you, O sons of Israel. Do not fight against the Lord, the God of your fathers, for you cannot succeed. Let me ask you, what is the second reason then that Abijah lists as to why the people of Israel are not going to succeed in battle against Judah?
Because God is their head.
Because God is their head. And in contrast,
Mhm.
what is Jeroboam's kingdom like?
Golden calves and his false gods.
Yeah. Abijah admits fully, he says, you guys do have a ginormous army. You do have a multitude of people, but you've got the golden calves that you're worshiping. You make anyone a priest. Abijah says, in contrast, we only make sons of Aaron priests. We follow the Lord in the way that he dictates that he wants to be worshiped. We have the table of showbread and the incense. We offer burnt offerings morning and evening. You're worshiping in a deviant way. We have God on our side. Well, Jeroboam doesn't heed Abijah's warning here, and we kind of see how this goes for him. Verse 13, Jeroboam had sent an ambush around to come upon them from behind. Thus his troops were in front of Judah, and the ambush was behind them. Not a good spot for the people of Judah. And when Judah looked, behold, the battle was in front and behind them. And they cried to the Lord, and the priests blew the trumpets. Then the men of Judah raised the battle shout, and when the men of Judah shouted, God defeated Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. The men of Israel fled before Judah, and God gave them into their hand. Abijah and his people struck them with a great force, so there fell slain of Israel 500,000 chosen men. Thus the men of Israel were subdued at that time, and the men of Judah prevailed, because they relied on the Lord, the God of their fathers. And Abijah pursued Jeroboam and took cities from him, Bethel with its villages, and Jeshna with its villages, Ephron with its villages. Jeroboam did not recover his power in the days of Abijah, and the Lord struck him down, and he died. But Abijah grew mighty, and he took 14 wives and had 22 sons and 16 daughters. The rest of the acts of Abijah, his ways and his sayings, are written in the story of the prophet Iddo. Yeah. Why do you say that, Cuppy? I know. And I think you're getting to where we're going to end up in just a couple of minutes here. But we can see in this text that Abijah is disregarding what God had said about multiplying wives.
Most of them did.
Yeah, we might circle back around to that in just a minute. Let me make a couple of observations, though, just from the section we read. First of all, don't miss the fact that this victory is from the Lord. The men of Judah, they're outnumbered, they're ambushed, they're fighting a battle on two fronts, back to back in some ways. There's people in front of them, behind them. This is a terrifying position to be in as an army. And yet they cry out to the Lord, and God delivers them. 500,000 men of Israel are killed, and it's not because of their might or strength. Verse 15, God defeated Jeroboam. Verse 16, God gave them into their hand. Verse 18, the men of Judah prevailed because they relied on the Lord. So I trust that is in and of itself is an encouragement to you and I. Trust God. There are times in our life when we are overwhelmed, when there are circumstances that are bigger than our control, much like the people of Judah found themselves in here. Where do they turn? To their sword, to their chariots? No, to the Lord. Trust God, have faith in him. He's in control of every circumstance. There is no army that is too big for him. There is no military strategy that is too good for him to be outmaneuvered by. God doesn't ever look down on earth and think, oh man, that's a situation that I can't intervene in. The opposing circumstance or trial or army is just too big for me. No way. God proves time and time again that nothing is impossible for him. Something else that stands out to me from this text pertains to Jeroboam. We're told here in these verses that he did not recover his power in the days of Abijah. Even more than just not recovering his power, though, we're told that God struck him down and he died. I want us to just, as this kind of concludes the life of Jeroboam, I want us to think again about how he came to power and what his kingdom was like. Remember, God had told him through the prophet, I'm going to give you 10 tribes of Israel. Jeroboam, if you stay faithful to me, I will build your house like David's. You will have a sure house if you stay faithful. But what did Jeroboam do? When he became king and he realized that the people might still return to Jerusalem to worship God, Pastor John pointed out so well for us that he devised a plan in his heart and said, I can't let the people go down to Jerusalem. I know what God has said. He builds the golden calves in the north and in the south of Israel. He followed his heart. He had the world at his fingertips. He had the promise of God's blessing. He had a kingdom in front of him, and he squandered it because he followed his heart. He let his heart call the shots. He had every opportunity to have a thriving kingdom and a dynasty, and it just slipped through his fingers. Don't trust your heart. Don't let it be the guide of your life. Yeah, it's deceitful. It's desperately wicked. Proverbs 3:5 keeps coming to mind here as I just think about this story. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. Quickly, I would like us to turn over to the parallel passage in Kings. It's 1 Kings 15. It is much shorter, but contains some critical information about Abijah. One of the things, excuse me, one of the things you'll notice is that his name slightly changes in Kings. He's called Abijam instead of Abijah. Same guy, though. I'll just read the first 5 verses, and I want you to pay careful attention to the evaluation of Abijah's life. We've just read a story of his from Second Chronicles, but what does Kings say about him? Verse 1, now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Oh, I'm sorry, 15:1.
14.
15.
15. Oh, okay. Okay, sorry.
All good.
Yeah.
Now, in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijam began to reign over Judah. He reigned for 3 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Abishalom, and he walked in all the sins that his father did before him. And his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem, setting up his son after him and establishing Jerusalem, because David did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and did not turn aside from anything that he had commanded him all the days of his life, except in the matter of Uriah the Hittite. We'll stop there. Let me just ask you, what is the evaluation of Abijah's life according to First Kings?
Good.
Yeah, why do you say not good?
Because he was a wicked king. He didn't follow in David's footsteps. He didn't follow the Lord. His
Yeah.
heart was not loyal to the Lord.
Mm. Yeah, verse 3 kind of sums it up. He walked in all the sins that his father did before him, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God. We just considered Abijah's father last week, Rehoboam. If you turn back one page to 1423, you'll kind of see what the spiritual climate was like in the days of Rehoboam. We read, they also built for themselves high places and pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. This is what life was like under Rehoboam. Now his son reigns, and the Bible says, and he walked in the ways of his father. It seems like Abijah actually is an idolater. If you remember in Rehoboam's life, God had actually sent a prophet to him and said, Rehoboam, you've abandoned me, so I'm going to abandon you. And the king of Egypt came and he came to the temple. Pastor John told us last week, and there were all of these shields of gold. Well, the king of Egypt took those gold shields, and Rehoboam had to make bronze ones as replacements. Right? Abijah presumably has seen what happens when you walk away from the Lord. And yet he walks in the path that his father walked.
Yeah.
The final evaluation of Rehoboam is that he did evil. He did not set his heart to seek the Lord. The evaluation of Abijah is that his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God. The question arises then, and I think you're wondering this, how do we reconcile these two accounts? We just read, if all we had was Second Chronicles, we would probably finish that story and think to ourselves, hey, Abijah's a pretty good king, right? It seems like he fears the Lord. He certainly talks about all of the right practices of worship that the people of Judah are participating in. He knows the covenant that God had made with David. But then we come to First Kings and we find out, not so fast. He's not as good as we thought. So how do we reconcile these things? Any ideas? How might we give an explanation for what seems to be two competing accounts? Yeah, Copy.
I would say that God used him when he needed to be used.
Okay.
He'll use the good and the bad.
Okay. God used him, maybe even in spite of
Right.
his evil heart.
Right.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Says in verse 4, what? Because for David's sake.
Okay. Yeah, I think you hit on another key idea. It really seems like Abijah only uh, is only allowed for his dynasty to continue. His son is only made king, not because of anything good he did, but because of David. Jerusalem is only established, not because Abijah was great, but because David was faithful to the Lord. If you grabbed one of these sheets last week, Pastor John's and mine actually, seminary professor, concluded about Abijah that he has creed without conviction or conduct, meaning that he believes that Abijah said some true things. He talked a good game. He knew Israel's history. He could tell his opposing army, hey, I am a son of David. Hey, we do these things in Jerusalem. We do, worship God the way that he wants. He had creed, he knew biblical language, but maybe the conduct wasn't there. Maybe he wasn't actually living that out. Yeah, Brenda.
But just a question, he starts off as not trusting the Lord, but he ends up trusting the Lord. He was successful in defeating the enemy. Could he have turned? Could he have seen, well, look what God does when you trust him?
Okay. I think maybe you hit on another explanation. So this is just one explanation. Maybe he is someone who just has creed, who just says a big game, but doesn't actually have actions that support it. Perhaps, Brenda, you're hitting on another explanation for this, which is, I think, encapsulated in verse 3, that his heart was not wholly true to the Lord. So maybe in Abijah's life, there were times that he was faithful to God, right? Maybe Second Chronicles is one of those instances where he does right. But let me ask you guys, is the standard for following God to just, do good things every once in a while and then sometimes dabble in idolatry? No. I think this verse is awesome because it tells us that the problem was he did not wholly follow the Lord. Maybe he did sometimes. Maybe Second Chronicles is one of those times. But that's not God's standard. His standard is higher than that. His standard is what we see in David, who followed all of the commandments of God. Now, the author is generous or kind or maybe accurate when he says, there was one instance that David did not follow the Lord, but on the whole, the trajectory of his life was that he obeyed God's commands, and Abijah fell short of that. I actually, well, let me say this. I wanted to make a couple of conclusory comments, and I'll take your question at the end, Cubby. From this story, I think one of the things that we need to consider is that biblical literacy is not a sufficient indicator of someone's spiritual health. Here's what I mean by that. If you see someone who talks a lot about God, who maybe is knowledgeable about certain facets of theology, they know a lot of scriptures, they can engage in theological discussions, as we see Abijah do. Does that indicate or guarantee that they are actually someone who's walking with the Lord? No. What should we be looking at in addition to maybe what they're saying? What's a better indicator?
Yeah.
Their fruits.
Their fruit, their life, their heart that drives the actions they take. Right? Abijah certainly knew true things about God. He made some nice claims, but the final evaluation of his life is that he walked in the ways of his father, the idolater. His heart was not wholly true to the Lord. And certainly we shouldn't just be running around looking at other people and evaluating their lives. I think there's an exhortation for us to look inwardly as well.
Yeah.
And just consider, like, am I just a person who only ever talks about God? Am I just a person who enjoys even like debating other people about maybe nuanced things in scripture? I'd be happy to share my perspective about God and kind of flaunt or flex my intellect about God. But I think it'd be wise for us to do some soul searching and really evaluate, but is my heart dedicated to the Lord? The standard isn't just partial obedience. The standard is wholly devoting ourselves to the Lord. Second, and that kind of brings me to the second point, let me challenge you to evaluate the extent to which you're following the Lord. If following God is a meter, where are you on that? Is it kind of following, 2/3 following, or is it the expectation that God wants of wholly following the Lord as David did? One of the things that is really interesting to me is that between Chronicles and First Kings, we actually have a description of the heart of the kings from David to Abijah, even past Abijah. I'll just read those for you. So with David, we're told that he is a good example of someone whose heart was wholly true to God. He is the standard. If you want to know what it looks like to follow God wholly, look at the life of David. Solomon, he started down that path. He did well initially, but the Bible tells us when he became old and he had all of these wives, what did they do? They turned his heart. So, and the text actually says so that he was not wholly following the Lord. Him and Abijah have a similar designation. They did not wholly follow the Lord. Rehoboam, he did not set his heart to seek the Lord. Jeroboam, I mentioned earlier, he devised a plan in his heart that ended up being contrary to God's plan for him. He followed his heart when he shouldn't. Here, Abijah, we're told that his heart was not wholly true to the Lord. Which one are we? Are we Rehoboam, who did not set his heart to seek the Lord? Are we a Solomon or Abijah that is kind of like a partial, or we do it for a time, but we don't wholly follow the Lord? Or are we like David, who in everything sets his heart to seek the Lord? Let me encourage you not to be like Solomon and follow him for a good chunk of your lifetime and then fall away at the end. Don't become distracted. Follow Jesus wholly. Take up your cross daily. Die to yourself. Yield your life, your desires, your passions to the Lord. Give your heart in its entirety to God. Seek Him and finish the race strong. I think what we see here in Kings and Chronicles really can inform our prayers for ourselves and for our church, that our hearts, individually and collectively, would be turned towards the Lord.